My name is Mia Armstrong-López. I'm a managing editor at ASU Media Enterprise and one of the editors behind the Future Tense Fiction series, which publishes a short story every month in Issues in Science and Technology. And today I'm joined by Erin K. Wagner, who is a professor by trade, a medievalist by discipline, and a writer of speculative fiction by design. Her creative writing has appeared in award-winning magazines like Clarkesworld, Nightmare, and Apex. Her first novel, Mechanize My Hands to War, looks at androids in Appalachia. And Erin is the writer of our August Future Tense fiction story, which is The Middle. So, Erin, thank you so much for being here with us. And I wanted to start by asking you if you could just tell us in a couple of sentences what The Middle is about.
Sure, yeah. So the middle was inspired by a lot of articles I'd been reading at the time, but it looks at a chef, young chef who's just gotten a job in a kind of restored hotel in Atlantic City and is very excited, but finds that he is responsible for sort of training and getting working a robotic chef. And the people that he works with are part of a union who decide to strike because they're concerned about what this means for their own livelihoods. So he has to navigate essentially what he feels about crossing the picket line, working with this robotic worker, and what that means for the idea of like the artistry of food and how we consume food. So.
Yeah, and well, I mean, just in hearing your description of this story, right, you're starting to give us an idea of like all of these really big picture issues that the story is dealing with, right? Like these big political and social and economic and environmental issues, right? Like from how automation affects labor to how climate change is affecting supply chains and the food we eat, and then even this like other big, really sticky question, which is like what we expect and desire from like luxury, quote unquote, luxury experiences, how we define those experiences. So I would love for you to just like sort of walk us through a little bit more. What are the big like questions that sort of magnetized you to the story, the big sort of tech policy questions that you think about when you were thinking through the plot?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of just the inspiration is that currently in our zeitgeist, it seems like there's a lot of fascination with the kitchen, like exemplified by shows like The Bear and things like that.
Yeah.
But as a science fiction or speculative writer, I've been seeing a lot of articles in the New York Times about how people are turning to foraging and other kinds of maybe less conventional food sourcing, and it was being kind of repackaged as a luxury item for high-end restaurants, right? So this idea of, in some ways, how we appropriate or reappropriate things that we might associate with like bare necessity or getting by, and then it gets changed into luxury, and what that means against a backdrop of climate change that is upsetting supply lines, which I think we've experienced recently as well. So kind of more extreme versions of that, in a city that, in the story at least, has dealt with even more severe flooding in that area than we've seen. So, how does the city recover if it recovers? Can we bring back the idea of luxury, or is food now something that is more basic? And then I teach English and do a lot of work with how to integrate AI onto our campuses. I mean, in general, I'm largely opposed to it, but I'm trying to figure out how you navigate that in the context of a society that's constantly saying, this is a must, we have to figure it out. And so for me, some of the angle of that is on the union. I'm part of the union at my school and how we navigate our jobs in the face of this. And so for me, that extrapolated to the idea of thinking about an advanced AI slash robotic chef who's not sentient. This is not a Wall-E character, but is advanced and taking that place in the kitchen that may be jeopardizing other people's jobs. So just reflecting on what we sacrifice as well as gain through those technologies.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and that last part is something I actually wanted to ask you about because we sort of find our protagonist Noah is like in this really hard sort of ethical spot in the story because, as you described, we have this new chef robot, sort of cleverly named sous chef, and Noah is sort of threatened by the owner of the restaurant of like, oh no, you need to figure out a way to make this chef work, this robot work within the context of the restaurant, or else everyone's job is going away, right?
Mhm.
So he sort of decides to be on the inside and presumably try and protect his coworkers' jobs from the outside, but there's some resentment from his coworkers from the outside of like he's crossing the picket line and doing that. So is that sort of like a dilemma that you think is sort of playing out currently among some of these like more creative professions? And how do we sort of like how does that ethical dilemma play out in our maybe current reality?
That's a good question. So I think first and foremost, there's the issue of is his ethical dilemma what he thinks it is, right? So is it like I'm saving their jobs if I do this, or is that what I tell myself as far as a choice, right? Um, and near the end, one of the other strikers is potentially poised to make the same decision, and we have to think through like how that will go. I do feel like a lot of people right now are being asked to choose sort of, are you getting on board with this? Lots of stories about people basically helping to train AI without quite knowing whether their job goes away once they've trained the AI. So I do think that is a question. So are you a team player or are you willing or able to cause trouble, right? And I think that's also sort of regardless of modern technology and where we are, kind of an unending question of the labor struggle is like, I need money to get by. Can I afford to resist the system I'm in or not? And then technology complicates that even further.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because I read, in describing a lot of your work, your fiction work, sort of you say that it revolves around how the human responds to the non-human. And I think that is certainly coming through in this story and in some of these sort of threads that we're discussing right now. But I'm curious, like, if we could take a step back, like, what drew you to that question of how the human responds to the non-human in the first place?
Well, I don't know how far back to go in my life now. It seems like I've, of course, always been fascinated by fantasy and sci-fi. So I grew up reading really traditionally, certainly not without their own problems, but things like Narnia and Lord of the Rings, and had sort of a faith background there as well. And then that faith background turned into medieval study in religion, which is always thinking about how are we defining, relating, ostracizing, what are we doing based on our ideas about elements that are not us. And to me, this extrapolates then to larger abstract systems, but also like the other concepts of the sort of the academic other. And then ultimately that comes down to, well, how do I treat there's a book called You Look Like a Thing and I Love You that's about AI learning. And it's kind of like you look like something that I made that I'm anthropomorphizing. So how am I ultimately relating to that? Which is sort of the age-old speculative fiction question of is this person worthy of rights or dignity? Is it a person? All of that stuff. Um, and so to me, it just seems like all of my interests end up converging on how do I, as a human, relate to other things that are not human, whether that be thinking about faith structures, thinking about um, environment, thinking about aliens, thinking about robots, sort of a perpetual question.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting, and that the author of that book, actually, You Look Like a Thing and I Love You, is another future tense fiction contributor, Janelle Shane, who wrote this really compelling story for us about an AI haunted house. It was advertised as an AI haunted house, but really, it's like what you come to learn through the story is what is being advertised as AI is mostly just like human labor, but that then is sort of like given a veneer of like fancy tech. So it's a really interesting exploration in that way. And I think it ties into a lot of the questions in this story too. And in particular, like there's a point in the story where Noah and Sous Chef, the robot, are like working together, like or trying to work together in the kitchen. And there's a critic who comes and reviews the restaurant, right, under this new like half human, half robot kitchen staff. And there's in the story there's a part of the review of the restaurant, and the critic writes, thanks to its robot chef, the food is the most precise I have ever eaten. But do we crave precision in our food? And that question here, layer of like, do we crave precision in our food? What is it that we're actually looking for? Um, Struck me as like so compelling, and really tricky to think through. So I wanted to ask you to think through it a little bit too. Like, what do you think people crave in our food? And do you think that that changes over time?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to approach this in maybe two ways. The one is how scary I find um, the idea of AI or robotic labor when it comes to art. Obviously, there are all the things about intellectual property and the things that I think a lot of artists are anxious about. But it's often very easy for me to say, oh, AI doesn't have soul. It could never produce anything. But the thing is, I also don't want to test it. There's no part of me who wants to go in there and be like, write something like Erin K. Wagner and see what it does. Because I'm scared on some part of me that says, maybe it can produce something that's this, and maybe we're all predictive algorithms on one level. So it gets kind of scary. And I think the story is dancing around a little bit like, is this the critics' preconceived perceptions? They're going in knowing that they're going to dine in this sort of fad, this chef that's being advertised. So are they going in opposed to that and they're ready to say, oh, I find this soulless food in some way? Um, is it or not? Which is a question. Um, which scares me. I like to believe and think that humans do produce something that AI cannot, especially knowing how AI works. But, there's a little part of my brain, the little fear part that's like, don't check though. And then with food, I mean, I know all too well that for me, food is often celebration. Like if something good happens, oh, we'll get a good meal, right? If something bad happens, oh, it's comfort. It's associated with so many different aspects of our lives that feel more like emotion than like our physical needs. Like obviously there's Maslow's hierarchy and like we need nutrients to eat, but I don't think a lot of us actually work with food in that way. I would say even people who are very nutritionary focused, there's probably a certain emotional pleasure or satisfaction that comes in mapping that out or how you look or how you feel than maybe just like a purely scientific interest in your macronutrients or whatever. So, I mean, perhaps it's hypocritical because things I eat for comfort food are just total crap and we're probably just dumped on the line somewhere and like there's no probably great human soul that goes into a Cheeto, but I don't know. Then that comes in with the idea of luxury, right? Like I expect something more though if I'm going to pay lots of money for it, right? So I don't know. I don't have a firm answer I've arrived at there, but that's me sort of thinking through it out loud.
No, well, I mean, I don't think that there is a firm answer, but I it is very interesting because we think about like I think you're so right, the emotion and also the memory like involved in food, like a lot of
Mhm.
the food that I'm drawn to or have an emotional connection with is because of some past memory or connection that happened with that food. And it is interesting, like you mentioned, the bag of Cheetos. Are the respondent to this essay, Christy Spackman, like talks a little bit about how it is actually there's sort of like two categories, right? Because on the one hand, it is like very miraculous that like a bag of Cheetos can taste the same like where I am in Arizona and where you are in New York, despite the fact that we're like so far apart. And then also it could probably taste the same, like depending on exactly what bag you buy, but like in Japan or like these sorts of things, like the miracle of being able to like standardize taste and flavors despite like all of these really complex factors among supply chains is like sort of a technological miracle of food, that then allows us to revisit those emotional experiences and connections that we had because the bag of Cheetos that I eat when I'm, 34 tastes the
Yeah.
same as the bag of Cheetos that I ate when I was 12. But like at the same time, when you bring it into some of the realm of like luxury, or like dining experiences or culinary experiences, right? Because everything is an experience now. Like that is where you want sort of the variation and you want the chef like foraging that mushroom that day because it's good in that particular environment. So I think it's just really interesting how all of that comes together.
And I guess on a class level, if you're thinking about, well, once you want that experience, it comes with sort of a manual labor aspect feeling to it, even though it's being operated on sort of an elite level. So there's that weird contrast between what we'd associate with sort of manual labor, which our society sometimes dismisses, and then consequently automates it in a lot of ways. But that's exactly what we're seeking when we're looking for the experience. Yeah, that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's almost like the sort of it's a contrast too because sometimes AI like chatbots and these sorts of things, generative AI are advertised as being something that is really personalized and really responsive, right? But in reality, when we think about it's ultimately anonymous, right? It's not actually personalized in that way of
Mhm.
like sort of the human interaction that you might get in a restaurant with a waiter or with a chef, and the things that people are willing to pay a higher premium for.
Well, and like the Cheetos, I guess, that taste the same, generative AI working from a lot of predictive models is just like, what is the template that's already out there? Plop it in, it's satisfactory, it's the Cheeto of information, whether it's nutritious or helpful in that moment.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are a ton of sort of intertwining and overlapping issues in this story: climate, food, labor, luxury. It's a really fascinating exploration of how all of those threads interconnect. And I encourage everyone go read it. It's available now on Issues in Science and Technology at www.issues.org. It's The Middle by Erin K. Wagner. And Erin, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.